your normal life, in fact, was a creative expression. And part of that creative expression was the literal you, or the identity, which is organized around the continuity or survival. But you also see that the many dimensions that you discover in accident or in retrospect, or you may find in the art, a kind of reflection. And they find, as we discussed at one point, that many cancer doctors seem to acquire the very cancer that they treat. So that many, even in most circumstance, one runs into themselves in their career and their expression while they're caring for something. So I was discussing something with someone the other day who was in the throes of a kind of dying feeling, because it was a dying feeling, was actually happening. Their body was slowly giving in different parts. And and in the aloneness, at times, there is an agony that can be the agony of, so let's say, but what would have it be different is that if I then went into the room and saw a friend in agony, I would experience some of the agony, but I would still be separate from it. So you see that the person you're talking about does that very thing. They care for people who are in situations. And they bring them perspective and sometimes physical help, but oftentimes enough psychological space, not as a wooing or as a trip or anything like that, but actually have a perspective on something where the pain is not only your enemy, but it is also indicating a happening that's taking place. That somehow, if you get it, then you see that the symptomatic elements of it, they don't need to scream at you if you get it. So you enter into a naive world with a relationship with the body that you took for granted as your ownership. And it has an exceeding pain for a moment that shows you how dumb it is, your possessiveness, when it's calling out. And not all, and it has been, so you meet, we'll say for a moment, even though you've met this body and relationship to body throughout time, you meet it now at this point in your life when almost everything has been reflective, because everything seems to be up in the air with this backdrop, that everything has to be considered against the backdrop of this virus, what you wear, what you do, what you go out with. So that somehow a missing thing is considered, whether you believe in it or not. Belief isn't required. It's like believing in God or not. And I say, well, I don't believe in the guys that they created a lot, because I saw that they were figments that were necessary for their time, or symbols. But I do believe that there's, without belief, I see an energy running through the story that's in it, but not of the story, that there is a dialogue, somehow a hidden conversation going on with an energy. And when there's innocence in you, it's innocently experienced. As it becomes rules and organized regulations or whatever, one loses genuine contact with the energy. And then one is being forced to assume that the literalness of the circumstance is your relationship to God or whatever. When there's inherent, it's like, you see they can't manage it in the convents and they can't manage it in the monasteries, that your relationship to God is enough. If you see that somehow there are relationships in the world and for them that resemble the relationship to God, that have innocence in them, or okay. So everyone has been trying to handle this thread, a thread that runs through the story in different relationships. We step into a life that has now the backdrop. And the backdrop is that this is happening, and it's in fact affecting much of the structural life as we know it. And so when you look around for life as it is supposedly now, if you look to the news or this or that, you then find impressions. That the news resembles almost the movies, where they no longer have to be true or accurate. They're impressions of things that are happening. And as we experience it creatively, it's more an impressionistic existence. And with, to some degree, impressions literalize as actions and belief systems. But for us, the impressions give more evidence of a fluid world and a fluid life. And that the premise for us to some degree is that not that history meant a literal thing was happening, but if you were there in history, you would have seen a multi-dimensional thing happening that resulted in this or that was happening. As you walk past it, you would have experienced history as mystery because you were in it, not of it. And you would have found people fighting or killing or, but since you were in it and then not of it, the motive for it would be missing. So one would experience in relationship to the literal history of being a stranger in a strange land, even if you saw Jesus across the street and it was a real situation and it was a mother and 12 adolescent young men who didn't have jobs or anything like that, and then, you would have seen a different reality. You would have seen maybe our house or our friendships or, you know what I mean? And you would say, holy shit, our house looks like the house that Jesus lived in. At that time, we had all those people who were broke and they didn't know what to do. Some blind people, some short people. Okay. But they all looked like they were unemployed people. So they say, okay, I never had that realization about Jesus and the family. And why would they go to a manger unless they were broke? And why would they have the old guy with them unless that she was alone with the baby? And they okay. So then, holy shit, you have a moment where there were people in their weird social structure where they normally didn't care about people in trouble, okay, that people then had to. So then you meet yourself. 2,000 years later, you see the spirituality of your existence by taking away the excess. And they say, holy shit, all of that stuff that looked weird had an underlying dimension running through it that you only discover in time, because discovery is the necessary ingredient for one to see the next step. And discovery somehow comes when there's an accumulation of failure of discovery, where the essence of something one is seeing is not there and it literalizes. So we'll say caring for someone that may have been a blessing at one point becomes a job. And as it literalizes, it actually literalizes. It may even crystallize in some ways. Where something, and so as it becomes a job, the structure of jobs is usually you lose the feeling for it creatively as it literalizes as a job, because you're doing it as an expression of your own, as an artisanal expression, would not literalize so easily as a job, where a job is an aspect of earning, but it's not the totality of it. Somehow the freedom to express yourself was important. And that your job was that freedom to express yourself, that in some way it wasn't organized. Oh, how are you doing, Ursha?
And Danny, when did that happen on the planet, which we're just talking about? But it sounds...
I say it's happening.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I didn't hear the beginning.
We're having the impression that the human history is, in fact, the only reality that is happening in the universe. When if you see it from the universe, you see a very pipsqueak thing happening for humanity. So you can even see it happening for bed bugs. They get together, where are we? What's going on? And the bed bugs are having a fight with the cockroaches or something like that in there. Okay. And you say, holy shit, is this whole thing happening where you see all of this stuff is actually an evolving energy in some way?
Yes.
But you're in it and it's literally happening. They have the headline in the paper today is that this was the biggest drought in 1,200 years. And it looked like the same day out there. It looks dry today. They're expecting snow today, but I'm in the middle. Biggest drought in 1,200 years is right out there. I have a glass of water here. Okay. In the biggest drought. What is going on? Is it happening? Or is it not happening? We're still existing while they say it's really up in the air, aren't they saying climate-wise? In fact, they're even saying it doesn't matter anymore. It's not so much up to the human race what happens any longer. They can do or not do or do their trip.
Don't look up.
Don't look up. So then they say, well, hold it. Is that a threat or whatever? Isn't it as soon as you're born, you're dying? So aren't you talking about the means of dying or passing away, whether you fall down the stairs or you come out wrong or you hang around for 100 years and still run marathons as an old lady running marathons? Still one is against the backdrop, whether you call it the virus or not, but it's against the backdrop of dying and living. There's an end to the movie, but there's a movie lives on in the memory of people who loved it. And maybe even the people who played in it then have a life that comes out of it. So you could see, without overextending it, that life is not limited to the possessive of the person. That the possessive has some meaning in relationship to a thing that's ongoing. But then in relationship, the possessive sees that it has no power over the life. It had the illusion to delusion of power. And then when it sees that it's delusion of power, it sees the illusion of its you see a dimension that was written that somehow there was another time place played out in your life. And there were other dimensions of your existence unfolding, not only your history. And so there was in retrospect, you see a convergence of history and mystery, accidents and history colliding and splintering. And so splintering allows these different folks to relate for a moment. And in the relating, somehow the events then reconsider themselves, where that experience is incorporated somehow into the person's life. So incorporated means in some ways the mind may still have a possessive, but in fact it's trickled down through their existence, where you see that the so-called past is actually being lived by you in the present. And that somewhat looks like an incident or an accident, and it usually has to be innocent, so it's called accident or this or that, but innocent of the motive of power or continuity. And I say, why? Because there are certain love affairs that are not around survival. And when they become around survival, they start to crack at its core anyway, because they were based on a feeling and without which they start to dissipate. So then when can you say that when you meet and once you mutually perceive that, then you also see the different movies that you've shared, and you see the different roles that you've assumed in the different movies that you've shared. But then you also assume that everyone in the movie that you've shared recognized that they were in a movie together. And we'll say if you did mother, they recognize you did mother for them. Thanks a lot. That way you did a nice role. But somehow there's a creative conversation. And what would be the biggest challenge is to come back into the story and play yourselves, but from the point of view of the art. What an amazingly weird thing it would be if, in fact, it re-enters the story from the perspective of the art of it. The survival of it had reality, but it was the joke shared between them. And I say, why? Because when you recognize the art of it, you can do things that you couldn't have done without the recognition of it, which is you can laugh your ass off together and say, Spirit's going to make up a job tomorrow. He's going to go to the thing. He's going to teach some yoga there. And he's okay. And then on top of that, he's going to make some coconut drinks maybe. Okay. So we can laugh about a job that people take seriously because you have to do it or whatever. So somehow we have a sense that you want to try this, you want to do this, but it's not to do this. It kind of has to be genuine feeling shared between the people. So how dopey it is that you can just go out and use the store tomorrow, 5 people do this and give it a shot. And somehow it springs into an expression. Because somehow when something aha comes to you, you meet 20 people like you, who are also walking around with their hands in their pockets saying, I wonder if there's a guy named Derek waiting for me to meet out there and we plan something together. Okay. So let's say an accident is waiting. And why is it an accident? Because it has to be without the trip somehow, this phase, where it's not so much dominated by survival, but the life now is a creative act. And you see even what was taken for granted, even the dopiness of sitting in the bench and someone speaking and you just say hello, you see what was normal for you is that you can sit on the bench, and you can, to a stranger, say, hello, how's things going? You can see if someone's in trouble or whatever. But for yourself, you have to go alone. Oh, there's no friend in the room with you. So I think that since you are a doula, that meant a friend in the room with those who are experiencing this process of passing. And it wasn't so literally that doing, although obviously they would be doing from time to time, but it wasn't dominated by doing because it wasn't seeing dying as such a flaw or fault, but it had its poetry, if it had its poetry. And that's when it was a shared experience between friends who cared for each other in the process. And so that's where you were. It wasn't literalized. They would want you to literalize it again, but the part of the death process that you were talking about was not possessed by the structure or the societal factor. It was a shared experience that is usually hidden from those, just like any intimate situation. Intimacy was the basis, not treatment. And so in having the intimacy, one shares a feeling that is natural, but is hidden in plain sight. Like all the elements that run through the social fabric, they're fabricated or hidden or structured or sticked or towards what the society wants them to be. So it turns sensuality into a sexuality that has a particular karma to it. It turns it when in fact the sexuality is an aspect of it. It's more of a creative act than it is literalized. So that's why it's always imploding and exploding when you try to identify the urge into what the social fabric wants from you. But there are those who bump into themselves and they see that falling in love is the feeling. Then whatever expression comes out, you assume the identity of the falling in love, just as if you were in the play together. When you have the feeling, you can assume the identity, even though it's not literally you, it is you in a certain kind of experience. So what I did have to say is something that I was experiencing myself, and that it seemed like while I was active and I was doing some of the club exercise, my arm and my chest was going. And I was passing away while I was still exercising. Okay. So I was saying, what kind of shit is this? Okay. That I feel like some of the parts of the body are giving up. At the same time, it's pretty flexible and nice.
It happened to me this morning.
I understand it's happening. It's happening. It is not that it happened and then
Yes.
it went away. It just came out and said, "Hey, I'm here. You know, we're here." I
Yeah.
didn't. Sorry, we messed with your arm and your chest and everything, but just to let you know we're here. Okay. So understand that a lot of things that are happening to you now, Urja and Danny, is because we're here. So we're watching what you're doing. And we're watching when you're bullshitting people. When you when somehow there are moments now you have to be, and real doesn't mean in your face, but it may be
Right.
that I say to someone, "Hey man, you're pre-diabetic, stop the shit. You gotta stop tomorrow morning, rearrange the furniture, bro, because it's running away." So I say, usually you would take 10 years to be able to do it. I say simply, we're just conveying something simple. What's happening between us is now you kind of have to reinvent yourself. So the guy you were was more of a rehearsal. So that guy could eat shit and do all kinds of shit, but now we don't eat shit, man. We like the food to be pure in some way. It doesn't have to be big deal pure, but somehow you like it to be authentic food. And if we're hanging, we're sharing that. And so I do feel that when it's, we say the sharing means a no bullshit space, it means that this phase, the life is not dominated so much historically by you, but that somehow you've come back into the story from something of a different place where you're not dominated so much by the history. You have allowed it to be mystery, that they were just people. It doesn't release it entirely. There were people doing their version of just like you found your own life, that you were just people and you were doing your version of mommy, daughter, whatever. But you understand that there's a feeling that was shared that allowed something to happen. That would be very weird if the feeling wasn't there. So somehow the feeling naturalized something. And yet each person has a life and is navigating a life or whatever. They take the feeling that is shared into the circumstance. So when it's interrupted, there's usually a meeting with each other again around the feeling that resembles very much like parent-child in its extreme, when it's really a hold or a clear, in the hug is the clear feeling.
Mhm.
In the conversation is the hug. The hug isn't a go away, a do away. It's seeing it from the feeling, seeing the issue from the feeling. And so the literalness of the story doesn't dominate. It doesn't do away with it. It's included. But then you see it's included from a creative perspective. You see that life is creating these accidents that seem accidents, but it's kind of creating an accident of experiences so that the people will accidentally meet in a feeling.
Yeah.
And they'll think that the feeling that they're sharing is normal. And so they'll say, sure, you can do this, you could do that, things that they would never offer, and not even offer a ride to someone if they were passing by. Okay. So let's say if you feel for someone, you see the thou aspect share something. And it opens up a doorway in you of sharing, not only the person being shared with, but it opens up somehow a surprise in you of how naive the sharing is, that it's just, sure, the lives intertwine. Somehow a feeling allows it. But somehow there is always a questioning in the brain. And I say, why? Because what looks like a fight in the brain is not really a fight in the brain. It looks like in the social fabric, you have to overcome it. But what is happening? It is addressing something really that's happening. And somehow there is something in the being that is measuring something where it's kind of structurally natural, but is it genuine? And one is privy to it. They find out later, but the process is remarkable if you meet it. And it's not a do or don't process. It is a process in flux. And it is measuring to some extent what you would call its future. Somehow I feel that there is an intelligence in the being that is measuring the broken heart that's waiting in the story by measuring how true the feeling is. That somehow the relationship to the broken heart is part of its life's journey. And that it has to select something in the moment that will send it to that feeling. You want the jaw version.
Ouch.
Okay, so now let's say, as the writer of your own novel, you have created all the characters in it.
Yes.
And from the perspective of being the novelist of the story that you're in, you see all of the characters can break your heart because you've become so attached to each of them. And you've also become attached to their freedom to somehow evolve and find themselves in this and that. So let's say to some extent, at the same time you run in, they have to play a character. The character to some extent is the author, who then assumes the identity. You see, to some extent, there has to be an Urja for Urja. You understand? And I think to some degree we're creating that, even with Netflix or whatever, or with this pandemic, there is kind of a creative atmosphere in the circumstance that identity is fluid. But there needs to be a kind of Urja that says to Urja, stop it, lady, with this neck, and talk to your girl already, have an honest conversation with her. Stop the shit. Like the foot saying, stop the shit, give me a wash and soak me a little bit in some oils, and we'll have a conversation, that foot says to you. And you say, you're not cancer, you're not, I say, stop the shit, you're not taking care of me. So stupid personal conversation is not so stupid. The people didn't go around the world and meet in this weird place just by accident. I understand how. But if you look at our normalcy, you see a remarkable creative dimension in what looks like is normal and is taken for granted. And if I say, what philosophy got you up there in Boulder, Colorado at this time? And okay. So let's say that somehow there had to be an innocence in our experience that is not so defined by our history, but that somehow we've had different lives over time, but we've been the same being, experiencing, having different aspects of the experience. And somehow in retrospect, you see that the experience itself was the life that was being lived. So when I stumbled, which I've been doing anyway, when I stumbled upon the sleep story and the other things that came, and as you looked at, it kind of just released you from having to sleep or stay in bed if in fact you wake up, you know what I mean? And they said, look, you're creating it, and it's not artificial creating, that there are patterns that you can have, and that if you didn't come up under the workaday world like that, and you're being organized into an 8-hour sleep cycle or whatever because you have a job tomorrow morning or whatever. But if you don't have a job tomorrow morning, you're going to have a headache and have problems. And the guy said, if you don't have a job, you're probably going to take cocaine or a lot of coffee, if you don't have a job, because you have an 8 hour sleeping, but the reason you have an 8 hour sleeping is because you had an 8 hour day. But if you don't have an 8 hour day, you're going to have arguments with people. There's going to be problems going on. So someone says, are you telling me that all of this is coming out of because they force people into 8 hours of sleep? So that's that guy's book. I'll have to get it and we'll see it. How forcing people to sleep an 8 hour day, I think, has caused wars and and has created all this chaos.
Danny, I remember Shell told me when he lived in the Playboy mansion,
Yeah.
there was a time where they blocked off all the windows, so they had no outdoor lighting and they had no clocks. So they just were on their own schedule as far as waking and sleeping and eating, and they had no idea what time it was.
Boy, that must have been some very weird experience. Huh?
Yeah.
How many people were, you mean a few people at a time?
I don't know. I just remember him telling me that. Yeah, it was an experience he had maybe in the 70s or something.
Well, they're claiming here that the Middle Ages to the 19th century, most people went to sleep at sundown and woke 3 or 4 hours later. They socialized, read, ate, tried to conceive for an hour, and then went back to a second sleep. They said, but artificial light introduced something else. That people began forcing. So, I mean, it was an interesting article, but I was looking at this other fellow, how taming sleep, wild nights, how taming sleep created our restless world.
Hmm.
He says, because the sleep wasn't a choice. It was just like getting up or not getting up. It was related to the life that you were in. So everyone kind of knew around when to go to sleep or something like that, not as a rule or something like that. Sometimes some folks had to get up at different times to take care of the animals or take care of the babies or, So they said, but they didn't have to catch a train or take a car ride somewhere. They didn't have to, they didn't have that sort of schedule. They had a schedule that was natural to their environment that they were. So I don't want to extremely oversense natural, but I do say, okay, then the premise is that once one is no longer organized, so then you can see why one would, that there may be many reasons why one would hate a job that they're in or something like that. And it may not only be because of the job, but it may be what it's doing to their body or it's how it's shaping them around in a way that it's made to look stupid or something like that, because then you get treatments to continue something that may be really messing with your body, that kind of system. And they're not blaming the system, but they're saying there's something wrong with your body when your body is doing like a really miraculous thing and keeping its, self together and is juggling at it. But then you also find out that you can shift, and you have shifted. If you've gone on in certain artworks together, you may have even worked 24 hours together and not slept or napped or what. You find that you have been doing it all along. And the different conditions in your life, you may not have been able to sleep or go to sleep or shift your sleeping. Okay, so it is there already. But they've naturalized the sleeping around a kind of order or structure on the social fabric. I understand. In India, when you were living in the ashrams there, it was naturalized to wake up at 3 or 4 in the morning as prayer time. And then you did see, it was a kind of prayer. So then, for the last few evenings, then if I get up around 2 or 3, then I'm kind of lying there doing the yogic breathing with the, just slightly in the stomach and into the chest and then out. So 5-6 seconds in and out, but nothing so structured, and let the mind be free, because I've been exploring that state of the waking state has come to resemble more dreaming. that I'm up for around 2 hours or something. I think how fast it goes, I don't know, but where I'm up though, lying down, and you're kind of letting the mind, well, it's doing it anyway. But you also saw in the past you would try to overcome the thought process if it got too strong. So there was no such structure or whatever. There was letting it be. And it was very interesting. It kind of reflected on a lot of things that were happening. So we'll see where that goes with it, but it has allowed just the article, we've been doing it anyway. I've always been getting up around that time. But then they said they show you what meditation didn't mean, an artificial state of trying to do this or trying to do that. The premise of the use of yoga or the meditation as a trier is to incorporate it back into the social fabric where the meditation released you from ownership of the story, and it also released the thought processes that the owner has. But as long as you own the story, those thoughts are going to come with the ownership as a possessor. So then they say that meditation, this was not meditation. Meditation is when somehow you relax the literal story of you. And it's shed light on the story you were living. So then it was somehow coming from a place that was you before it was literally you. And that's why I'm saying if the rabbi or the priest said, are you a Catholic or a Jew? You said, I'm a schmucky person who happens to be this. I have some Catholic in me, some Jew in me, some this male in me, but anytime one of those dominates, it's kind of dopey. So then the expression is that the life force is expressed through the male. It's not owned by the male. There's a conversation going on with, just like all the characters in the movie are contributing to the larger movie, all the characters that one assumes in the collective are contributing to the creative act. But they are a play of an energy. And so from that perspective, there is no literal you. There is no sexual you that is literal. They say it's as dumb as saying falling in love and then you'll assume the identity, but it has to be true. So it may not be sexual. It may be that it's no longer co-opted by that literal world. It may express itself, the sensuality may express itself sexually, but from the other world, the sexuality owns it. From the creative world, the sexuality is an expression of something that kind of is true. It's coming, the sexuality shared between lovers is different than the sexuality shared between lonely, needy people. So between the lonely, needy people, it becomes a possessive, it becomes a way of possessing the other. From the perspective of the sensuality, the people are free, that in fact you couldn't make love if the people were not into it. You couldn't find yourself in a weird situation, say, please come on, do that. And they said, no, I don't want to. You couldn't even, as a joke maybe. You say, please, please. Okay. So that somehow there had to be some mutual, you can get around and do that, but somehow once there was a healthiness there, who feels to make love with someone who's strung out, and that's, so basically it's a shared experience. Because it is a shared experience. But then you're also talking about perceptively a shared experience. And I say, why? Because then you see that life lives on in memory. Well, it's not exactly memory, but it's a kind of life force. And there are manifestations that happen in time because it's pre-existing, that the memory is not exactly a memory of a past life. The memory is also a process that's happening in the present. So I had a conversation, Urja, with Stephen call through you.
Yeah,
He told me
he told me it was very sweet.
Yeah, it was sweet. Like, look, mother jumper, you
Was
better be cool for a while. You better be cool, my man. Yeah, it was kind of hipping us all to. This is a sadhana or a journey that we're sharing. So at this
Yes.
point in time, it's no trip. If you're doing something, it's because you see that there's some intelligence in the action, not because you're so much a poor thing. And so I do think that between us, it takes away the poor thing premise of personally holding this thing and kind of understanding our hanging together requires also that we've come to that feeling with each other.
Yeah.
And that there are certain heartfelt conversations that actually probably is a reason that people are connecting at a certain point in time now, because their lives are really at that point. So even though there is still that mental state that wants to carry on, there is something in the poetic or in the mystery experience that is not exactly planned in the same way. You know, in terms of it being a literal, when it's an evocative relationship, when in fact you're related to someone because you've been in 5 movies with them, but you haven't lived a life with them, but your only relationship with them is creative. Then you see that soul searching would be normal without it having to be neurotic or crazy, but soul searching would be part of your senses, just like smelling or hearing or seeing.
Yeah.
Then you understand when that becomes creatively true for you, you see that dreaming is no longer possessive. And I was kind of discovering that the other evening when normally you would go back to sleep. I was there and you saw there was a semi kind of dream state that was happening with it, but it was a lot of, well, I'm in this part of processing now, you know, with this overnight fasting, and we'll say I stop eating at 6 and I'll start eating at 10. So it's not fasting per se, but there's a processing. And the premise of it is that there's an active principle in a certain period of time in the hours. And then there's a period of time when the body and the being is processing its life and circumstance and its day. And so more and more that has been happening for the people who shared that kind of experience where there is the life as process. And once you see it, well, you don't only see a process, but you see the flux that not only Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, but you see it's not really Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. It's the earth turning, the light moving, and we're calling it Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. That's our name for some remarkable thing that we can't easily imagine, is that we're related to a cosmic movement. And we're calling it Monday and Tuesday. And that's okay. It allows you to get to work on time and doing this and that. But if you're ever exposed and usually dying somehow and coming back, you see, holy shit, Monday and Tuesday is not really Monday and Tuesday, but is this unfoldment that is taking place around me. And we are finding ourselves somehow in a situation on a large scale where there's nothing to do literally. And where the doing is more and more our invention. Maybe today I'll do the laundry, maybe I'll do this today, but it's kind of, or mañana, I'll do that tomorrow. But now you have this time, creative time that you can push onto the day and put something off tomorrow or next month or this week or whatever, where it may have been that you had to do it because it was a job. And you're seeing a life. And I don't know that it's completely at fault because it doesn't fit into the paradigm of survival. But it seems that to a large extent, the lives have been released from the literal. And in that being released from the literal, you can say something very dumb to, my man here, Spiro, why don't you just do a couple of weeks, days a week in the store there and create that tomorrow? It's like opening a business all of a sudden by accident. And it's not really a business, it's what you're doing anyway. It's just that you're sharing what you're doing at that time or whatever with others. Casey is sharing it with us back there. Now he's doing the duck.
Oh, the goddess with
No,
several
he's-
arms.
Mother Jumper, he's doing Mother Jumper.
Yes.
Okay, everyone. Has anyone else been on or just us four characters?
Jimmy Diaz and Michael Bravo said, question, the power of prayer in invoking spiritual forces to intervene in the literal world. Opinion?
So let's say where it comes from. And now we're also saying, as in us, where it's coming from. So if the continuity, that's how deeper you'll have the experience. In other words, the deeper you see something, the more it reveals other dimensions that have been parallel all along, theorized about. But
Yeah.
there is a perception that sees the parallel dimension, not as history, but you meet the mystery. And the mystery, when you meet it, is not a possessive of the self. In fact, there is a surrender of the self because the self has a limited possibility to experience its own life. Because there is another dimension of existence that is pure mystery, that has a surrender of the self, where it is caring for something, as I've mentioned in other places. And caring doesn't mean ownership. It's specifically, you understand, in the literal world, the child is your possessor. From the perspective of the energy, you are caring for the freedom and that there's a life to be discovered. You're preparing for that discovery. Discovery changes the plane. I mentioned before, if I read my mother's diary and I discover she's not my mother, she was a woman who was doing mother, everyone in the neighborhood knew that, I discover a mother who's a person, who's a woman, who's a hot woman, who has a life of her own, and yet somehow cared for me. And so what happens where you are then building a life that you've recovered from your mother and this and that, and all of a sudden you discover a person that you haven't met before. In fact, you see a resisted meeting, but any person, any friend in the neighborhood could have met that person that you meet 50 years later. The difference between the meeting is discovery. And discovery allows you to see a parallel life that has been lived by you all along, that you've intuited, that you've thought about, that you've accidentally seen. But then you see in a moment, there is a crack in the universe for you, where you see that you are not you, that you is an aspect of what is happening. And it seems then that you are then, once that is perceived, depending on the level that's perceived, it releases what would probably have been a mystery or a suggestion to you. It releases to you in plain sight. You see it almost as if you played in that movie. Your life then becomes segmented in a way that it may have been more 5 movies that you've been in rather than the literal life. One movie you were in Pittsburgh, one movie you were in India. So then you see, but the thread of you ran through you, but the thread of you is not literally you. You as the carrier of the story, you as the carrier of the energy. The story is not you. You meet your being. And when you meet your being, you re-enter into the literalness of, as we were kidding around generally here, and now an angel inhabits your life. They say, an angel says, would you like to do Urja? And they say, well, she's old. I say, sure, I'll give it a try. The angel would love to have the experience of what it means to be human.
It won't last long.
They say, can an actual person ever have that angel experience of purely being involved in one's life, where even the pain has a conversation going with it, where the pain is not even a possessive? Of course, you're dealing with the thing that's running away with the story, but at the same time, you understand it's indicating to look a little bit deeper. And as it's revealed, you see the revelation changes the picture. So as for me, as a kind of dying becomes conscious with the living, you're seeing something that's usually hidden in plain sight, where dying is also looking at the story, and it's not so much possessed as a horror movie or this or that. But there is a space then, and you understand that the energy has always been supposedly in yoga a quarter of an inch away from the literal existence. It required some accident that you would see. To me, the premise of returning to the story from the momentary perception is that that enters into the expression with you as if there's now a creative dialogue. Now you meet the dichotomy in yourself where you are giving readings to people about the deepest things that are happening to them, when the deepest things are happening to you alone when you go home at night. So now we say the character that helps out there needs to also visit you, not as a helper, but understand that you've also lived a life through the energy and the literal life. So the conversation would be simply the same conversation you would have if you were caring for the other. Even if it were you caring for the child in the environment. Not sneaky, not hiding, but also not having to push too many things that would interrupt creatively or share. You see that somehow the space that allowed you to care for others without being so pulled into the story that you couldn't care is also inherently something that's happening now with yourself. That from the energy, there's a conversation with yourself. So it may resemble to some degree a relationship or friendship in literalness or in passing or whatever, but that conversation would be had if we were together. If something happened in the moment, even if the cops came on the door and knocked it down, if we were both in the space together, we would kind of ask for a kind of decency by our presence. And somehow our presence would have some power over the situation. So then you meet something that can assume power when necessary around the grace. And you meet very close to your discovery of creative expression, of show business, of art forms, where you can assume the soul of the identity and know what it was really about. Not only can you portray the person's life, but you can portray the inner life. But then you can also meet your own inner life. And you understand that it is an inner life happening. And the inner life happening for you alone, but it is no trip. So it did seem I was passing for a moment there and everything that was failing, but I was still healthy enough to do this club exercise that I'm doing for flow. And observing it, because I had all the kind of medical ingredients necessary. They say, if this is happening to you or that is happening to you. At the same time, it wasn't happening to me literally like that. I was watching it happening.
Did this just happen recently, Danny?
Yesterday, I was playing with something, and then my one concern was that someone would come in and save me.
Mm.
You understand? They say, "Oh, come on, grab you," and anything. And I say, "No, it's cool." It's okay. So I didn't have a fight with the process that was happening, but was more seeing how thorough it was or whatever, and then it released. So I didn't do anything again. I went ahead with some the club movements, and just created the flow there. And then it did seem to pass, like that. But it does seem like it's hanging around. So it did resemble something like that would always happen with Dr. Koshak there, you always had concern that he would come down with a heart attack or something over some reaction or something. But that was built into a breathing asthmatic problem that is had there, you know. But we're in that kind of neighborhood where any incident, is that okay, Urja?
Yes.
But in
Yeah.
speaking to someone who is really caught up in the, or caught up because it hurts and you're alone, and you're also a helper, but at the same time, it comes with the experience. Somehow to have that experience is to know who you're talking to. To have that experience in yourself is to somehow empathize to whom you're speaking, where it's not only a fault that has to be cured, and you also understand it won't let you cure it with bullshit anyway, because a deep thing is happening. There is a conversation going on in your being, in your environment, in your body, that only includes you when you feel the pain. But there's a profound conversation going on, and you're only included because you got some pain. And so you're included in a process that you usually run away from.
Mm.
And running away from it is not a fault if you want to continue. But then you understand where continuity is not the chief factor in what is happening for you, but discovery is, or finding out what this life is, or deeply. Then you see that the continuity, once that is perceived, you change the continuity factor for being the reason of living, as they have in the social world. And discovery becomes more the creative reason for living. And that somehow, in discovery, maybe even the body, but the person reshapes themselves. So in discovering different phenomena of the same existence, and that this has been happening all along, and you meet your being, you meet it even in so-called, in retrospect, you meet your body when it was built into desire, and before it had desire, and then when it had desire, and you were confused by the roles you had to assume when what was written into the body, supposedly written in the body to have a child, to have a home, to have a literal life was written, and you don't know it, so you're confused about it all, while supposedly everyone knows what you're going through. But supposedly, in their terms, your body is being prepared to live a literal life. And you find out in retrospect. All you know is you're going through a process that is explained by others. And they explain it for their turn. But then you discover what they're explaining in logical terms is the mystery of existence.
Mm.
That confusion is not exactly confusion. Confusion is a way of it where the mind somehow is pushed out of the way, where it's not around knowing, it's around empathy, it's around awakening of dimensions. And I say, why? And he said, because when you awaken the other dimensions, that there's a child waiting for you in the future that you don't know about yet, but you may dream about or think about in absence. There's actually something that's happening to you. And there are conversations that are going on in your being and your body, around you, in circumstance. So what looks like accidents are really kind of planned by processes that are happening inside of you. You look at the life at a certain time with a certain eye, with a certain feeling. Accidents are waiting for you. So you see that all of these things that cannot be captured literally, but can be captured somehow if you were writing a book of it. And you would see that the writing of it itself would be a creative atmosphere where there to be other processes happening. While people were busy doing something, they would have an accidental meeting or see someone, another shift would take place, or what they call a face in the crowd experience. So then you experience the creative fact of the existence as a happening, not only in a future event, but as a matter of fact, coexisting with the everyday. That in the everyday that is normalized is a remarkably creative act that has you can improve it from math through acting to any perspective that you wish on it and include it. But you see the agreement that exists in the everyday. And what appears to be normalcy is experienced in its loss as something else. And then fear of its loss is inherently then, it looks like it's fear of normalcy, but it's fear of this creative loss that it's in. So if we discovered what we have been doing this year in retrospect, it would be a holy shit moment. Holy shit, did I just go through that year with this scene that I was in and it was normal? Okay. So you see, the normalcy is to kind of keep you out of the story. But the creative process is the life itself. And you could see that the psyche attempts to literalize through belief or association, as if the history is it, when the mystery runs through the history. For those of us who share an exploration, we are strangers in a strange land. We're visiting this place from a different place in ourselves. So there is an authenticity to the experience that doesn't want to be laid out in rules, that understands that before the rules capture them, the rules are more the corporate construct of continuity, that it was a creative expression. And that once you perceive it, somehow there is an inherent freedom even in your cells and your being. And when you go into a relationship has an I and thou element. It's almost as if a part of your body in the other. It's not the other. There's something shared in absence and presence. Their survival, their health, their feelings matter. There is a care. The doer, the literal, that's another dimension of it, because all things that are created, as they literalize, start to dissolve. So what looks like a dissolution of the form would be a love feeling, gives it a form, and if it turns to hate, then you can immediately see the dissolution of the form. Immediately. It has immediacy, just like the falling in love may have an immediacy. If it comes to what is called hate, but I thought it was explained to me once that the Bindu point there had the whole experience, that you added time and space to the experience. And as the experience literalized, there would be the very thing that was shared was lost, the thing that was just a normal sharing. So the experience went from the sensuality, as it became the sexuality, became a possessive. And then once it became a possessive, it introduced all these other ingredients that are part of the theater of life, of jealousy, hurts, this and that over. It has to be over nothing in some way. It's something to the person having it. But in explaining it, you would sound like a damn fool that you went to such lengths over the invisible. So yeah, any time that I think that some of us would try to literalize our historical, I say I come from the Vikings. If I meet some Vikings, there's going to be a fight automatically. Okay. Or if I come from this or I came from that. And I say, well, let's say I come from the Marines. And I say, I may have been in the Marines or a circumstance, but then I had an experience that released the story from its illusion that was neither bad nor good. But then had you understanding that you were no longer coming from that kind of historical mandate or pressure, that what you were doing, you were kind of originating. If you want to try this experience and share it, that's your call. But you can't blame the father or the mother or the country or the Jesus. Because why? I say because you see that Jesus also would have been a sucker for the experience, even if he was the Lord of the universe, and Buddha probably My feeling is that you came to certain terms in your life because then you opened up another conversation with the mystery. And then you then had another experience on the love, not as a possessive. You see, the very fact of the possessiveness of the life left it into a historical context of repetition. I would say this time, for most of us, whether we're going to pass away soon, whether this is happening, that there's a no trip element to it. That you're into it because you're into it. And that it's there is a reflection on it. Where then even you then take in the palette of your expressions and you see that fear is one of your expressions, not a dominant force. Fear is indicating something that's happening, creative. You may need to address the immediacy of it, but not to make it go away because it introduces you to hidden dimensions. Once you perceive the hidden dimensions, you are no longer locked into the karmic aspect of the life in the same way. It's not so much that you've relieved it, but you've introduced a dharmic experience inside the literal. So you die in a love affair. Is it cooler, nicer? I don't know, but basically, it's not your literalness that you're talking about. You see a shared experience. Even alone, you see the individual experience and the collective happening simultaneously. And it is as if you are in a movie. You see your individual expression, but you see those who perceive it with you share something deeply in memory. I feel something like that exists in the dying process also, as if you were in a movie that many friends saw. And so the passing or the not passing was relatively unimportant to the experience that people had in the shared space. Because then I feel that just like you remember the movie, the memory is a medium that just like it remakes the movie if it was great. I also feel that somehow if there's a deep enough love in the loss, there's an incarnative element that is taking place. Where it may be a passing stranger, or it may be an accident or a situation, but you see manifestations of the feeling or the shared feeling. And is it wishful thinking? I say sometimes it's wishful thinking, sometimes it's magic thinking, and sometimes it's one is no longer dominated by logical thinking. It's an aspect of the thinking. It's like calling in a lawyer when you need them. You don't want to have to study law creatively, but you also may need to have a friend who knows legal terms. You may develop that in yourself. I say that there's possible to open up a cast of characters within oneself that serve the purpose of the journey. And one of the things, it could bullshit, it can lie, it can goof, but it can't be a scheming, lying bastard rat somehow. Somehow all the elements that express themselves through you are coming from the director of the movie. And so the director of the movie is asking for authenticity. That somehow everyone, all aspects, even the body, a conversation with one's own body about everyone being on board if they're into it. And maybe having honest, even weird, honest conversations where the knees may want to give up. No, they're not into it. They don't want to see what happens. How dopey it sounds. It's not so dopey as an experience. It may even be like talking to your children in one way where there's a kind of honesty about what's happening to you without it being literally honest. But it's conveying a feeling. I feel the conversation that I had yesterday, Ursha, was around that. No bullshit experience. Where people, that it starts from a kind, and when I'm saying honest, I'm not only saying confessional, psychological, but that there's a common feeling that brings us together. And there's an integrity in that. Because if you look at the lives that we've lived, they haven't been such logical lives. So then it has been a life that you now experience on point as if you've been in many movies. And just as if you watched many movies of a character and you see the same character, but you see the different expressions and how talented they had to be to really do that because you kind of know them. Mary's going to New York soon in a few days there. And so she may meet this cast of characters out there, but just as friends, hanging around. And yet they can do this and they can do that. So once you see a friend creatively, the friendship allows an intimacy in the creative expression that has a different conversation. The friendship that you have in yourself with the role that you played in the life is having a conversation. And I feel that when you are in that moment, and I'm not just talking about relieving or make happy, I'm talking about realizing how deep it is in the everyday. And understand that there's a conversation that you'll have even in your passing. If someone reads something or finds something that you have in there or whatever, where there's a holy shit moment, they say, holy shit, how come we couldn't talk about it or be with this? And I'm not talking about something as being a psychological construct of doing something. I'm talking about talking as discovery. Discovery is the intelligence, knowing that possesses the story before it discovers deeply. I say that the parents and the child are yet to discover each other. And they've made discovery a psychological quotient as if it was a flaw. And I say, no, in order for them to survive, they had to have the literal idea of each other. But now for them to live, there's an accident waiting to happen where you discover, or I can say, I'm sorry, mommy, for being such a, how heavy duty I must have been from what was happening for you at the time. So you meet yourself and you saw that what you thought was heavy was also heavy in interaction with you. Because then people had to have secret lives and then be known by their secret lives as being them. So then what happens is a missed experience of a shared life, where the survival quotient dominated the fact of it. So what the sleep article just kind of released you from the 8-hour idea for a moment. That's all that it had to, since you didn't have an 8-hour day waiting. So it was, so of course, and then they showed you a whole movement in time and space, and then I've been doing it anyway. The body has naturally been doing it, and if you kind of have a yogic life or philosophical life, then you kind of your sleep patterns shift also. It's not so much related to the logical day; it's related more to a creative day. So I feel when it's related to a creative day, your experiences are also creative to some degree. So I was discovering that more and more as one was just there when you woke up in the middle of the night. It wasn't like a waking up enthralling, it was just a natural waking up. But then the lying there for that period of time was more like a dream state, it seemed, because time passed so quickly. And so that so-called that one was reflecting on became more dreamlike, and it's not the doer owned it or something, and it was doing something. It was more like seeing. Yeah. And what was the seeing? No trip this time. Is that okay? If in fact you're caring for each other, you're caring for each other.
Yes.
And that's because you share a common humanity or a common feeling. But it also may be used as a kind of reflection between the people to see where they're at in time, because they've normally been living with it. And that's what I'm saying. Look, what we've taken for granted as our normalcy oh, sure, tomorrow I'm going to meet this Tibetan girl, I'm going to meet this other person, and sure, it's very normal. So I say our normal is this creative act that's taking place, which has more of a Shakespearean play in it. That a Shakespeare looking at it would see all the Shakespearean elements running through it. And that would be the unsaid. How it would be magisterial in its announcement of the unsaid. When people then in retrospect would say, what happened to us? Then they would sing you this, the unsaid. While you were busy in your head, this was happening. And you found out about it later. And they say, why? Because you would have done something, tried to do something about it. When it wasn't so much the doer will be called when it's needed, but when the doer starts to possess the story all the time, it doesn't allow creative dimensions to express themselves. And I say, why? Because the doer is usually protecting itself from the experience, where it doesn't have a do available to it, where it's touched deeply or affected deeply. And so its expression then comes more of a naturalness that waits for that feeling to happen, and then there's a whole body of expressions that come with that feeling. But the feeling has to be genuine to unlock it. And that is when reason is no longer the dominant force in the story. But it has its play, where you see the illusory aspects of what is called normal everyday living. As it literalizes, it then creates a war around it because it's not true. There's an attempt then by the flux, the psyche in flux, to literalize its identity, or be known through identity. And so it attempts to literalize a life that is fluid. So from the perspective of us, I think that we have an experience that interrupts the continuity of the self and the history, and then has you look into a mystery. So we go to places, we meditate, we try the philosophy, we try this or that, but they're all evidence of the literalness of the life shifting into mystery. So then we attempt to literalize the mystery again to some degree. And I've been getting a lot of folks introducing me to the Sabbatai fellow again and researching that time. And then yesterday in the New York Times, there was the woman, that book I mentioned about the books of Jacob. Well, the woman who did the translation, did you read that story? Who worked with the woman who wrote the book?
I read in the book section, she's talking about the
translations and getting credit for translation. But then you saw the world of translation and how she translated the woman's book then into English, and what kind of job that must have been, or 4 or 5 different languages, and how, so then I still have the book to read, but they gave her credit for her translations, but the translation also gave you a sense of what was the book. I say, it's like walking through the forest. So in walking through the forest, you can start to notice simple things that you would read about. You can see the normalcy of walking through the forest. You can see the seasons interacting. You can see the conditions of the trees and the environment around you and the effect of the, and so you see it just by walking through it, and it's normal. And yet it's brilliantly conceived. And there may be a small thing that catches your eye that you look into it that opens up a whole other. So let's say once it is freed to some degree from the literal survival, it then walks into a creative space, from a creative space in itself. So then the literal self is one aspect of the creative experience, not the totality. So then as I'm reading about sleep and this and that, you see that the sleep is one aspect, and the 8-hour sleep is one way of sleeping. It is not the way of sleeping. That from what they read is sleeping was natural. They fell asleep at natural times if you were a farmer, if you were an artisan, if you were this or that. Or families, sometimes the family would agree to wake up at different times to function together in the situation. They're doing that anyway. If you had children to raise, you would wake up at different times to see how they were doing in the evening time, what they needed. So it was, so to recognize it, you recognize it somehow by losing it, by then seeing that so much of the problems that were written into the 8-hour day were not actually problems, but were effects of a system that organized the life in a way that wasn't literally happening. So for some, being into it meant something. Being into it then allowed you. And I understand too, when I remember in the service and this and that, where sometimes you had to sleep or be up all day and then sleep 2 days later or something like that, or you caught a 4-hour sleep or a nap on the way. And you did, and so you see that there's a whole movement of people that are adjusting their patterns. To some extent, they're struggling, but to some extent, they are discovering that the life existence is not limited to one particular expression. And I feel that even for us geezers, when we're kidding around with here's a year or here's a 2 to play with, it's not only dumb, it is in fact, you're changing time from a different perspective. And then to be able to actually create a friend within one's self, not with trips or this or that, but the very character that is there for others, sees that you have similar challenges that the very people you're advising. It comes with the turf. And so it's not around advice, it is in fact informing you that the life that you're choosing is more of a creative expression than it is literal survival. And so survival then shifts with you with that art creative perception, where it's not only getting enough food or getting it is in fact that there is something that speaks to you. There's a dialogue going on in absence. There's a relationship going on in the absence that manifests. And I say it's as real as having a love affair where someone's gone for taking a trip for a year or two. You still have the love affair in their absence. It resembles that in dying also, where the feeling persists or carries on. And the irony of it is that when the feeling persists, even in the passing away, it kind of creates an incarnative element. It may be accidental experiences that you run into that bring awaken and that aspect that holds the memory of an experience, where you see the experience was the thing. And then, and I say, why? Because then I see that I would have come back into this life to have the experience. Holy shit. The very experience that one struggles with and goes through this and that, you see that somehow it has been voluntary to have this experience. And you see how determined you were to have experiences in your life that everyone was counseling you not to have, that it was wrong or this or that. And you see the determination that seemed like stupidity that had to be talked out of it. You see, it wasn't exactly stupid. There was an experience waiting that released the story to some degree. And once it released the story, you experience somehow being free in something that you couldn't do even a moment before. We discover that you are not you. You are a caretaker of a happening. And once it becomes aware of it, the life turns into an artwork. And so what you're caring for is the integrity of the expression, no longer the survival in the same way. So then you then meet a Shiva or a Shakti when they say, what is celibacy? And they say, I make love when I'm in love. And I say, how simple the idea is. They say, why? I say, because if you perceive it deeply, your body won't lie. It won't work unless there's a true creative happening, because it's no longer around survival or continuity. It's meeting love on another level. where it's not a possessive, but it is an I and thou. And would one come back or hang out for it? I would say generally, I'm in the midst of something like that where I'm allowing an invitation to assume an identity in a circumstance. And so to some extent, I'm needing for the relationships to come from no more of a trip place so much. It's not so much around survival, or that survival comes out of your creative expression is no longer a dominant principle in your life in such a way that it owns it. So that's what I feel. The question is the motive that one brings to the story. Now, let's say even in the simplest way, one is looking for a partner, but one is deeply yearning for some truth. And the truth doesn't literalize. It's not an ownership of the human race. What truth is, let's say you experience the lack of it. So let's say that one has been having a conversation with the mystery all along while they are in their own history. So they think they're looking for a girlfriend or a boyfriend, they think, but you also see from looking at the larger picture, there's other dialogue going on. Then as it literalizes to gravity, you have the ego and the identities working it out. But from here, you start to release it from the ego's hold in the story, and you see a different play unfolding. You see an play of forces, of energies, of structures. And its commitment is to its own freedom. Because it is in its freedom it finds the truth. As it surrenders its freedom to the continuity, it starts to look then for that world while it's maintaining a status quo. It's also secretly looking for that world again. So there's an event waiting that is a flaw in the system, but saves the person from a continuity that may have become increasingly dangerous as it started to lose the feeling that gave it substance. So they say in some cases I was reading where the affairs sometimes save the relationships because you're no longer having that attraction in the relationship that you would have, that you were free somehow in the affair. So I'm saying, okay, when one starts to reflect on the life, you start to see many of the things that were literally happening were also evocatively happening, that somehow the life is an artwork. And that axiom that you cry, to cry at the movie is illusion, to throw your shoe at the villain is delusion. You start to see a feeling allows you an entree into the story, and then it allows planning. As the plan becomes the reality, the underpinnings start to shift. Because the plan usually was a byproduct of the feeling. The planners then would tell you that that was naive to make plans that you have to literalize, but as you literalize it, then each person usually goes underground to some degree. And I say, why? Because I think now the question is that it is still a creative process, even if it's literalized. So just because you've broken up doesn't mean that it's over in some way. The memory is there, the reflection is there, it may revisit you in the circumstance or whatever. So you see a parallel existence that looks like past and future. But there are events waiting in the situation. And you see that as the situation in your life literalizes, there are certain forces that can't meet each other because of the hurts that they've shared. So that the story is no way is it possible. It's not psychological. But then an event may be waiting that allows a, hey baby, how you doing? So simple, and yet it was impossible. And it wasn't possible. And it is so simple. And I say, well, what happened? And I say, there's the history and the mystery. The mystery may come to you in a way that instantly it dissolves the story. You see the underpinnings to the story. And also you see if in fact the hurt was that deep, then the feeling must have been pretty deep also. So you have a relationship with certain things that are happening in your own being. And you see the dialogue of your life is there in you. And in some way, even when you're watching a show on TV, you're seeing some reflections of your own experience, where the life is not yours alone in some way, but much of it has been your experience of it. So in that, the honest conversation is not some therapeutic conversation. It is a natural part of living, where you've assumed the roles out of love. When you've assumed them out of fear, then you see that there's some kind of thing running through the literal story. And now I say, for us, then the parent or the child or whatever, it's been a voluntary act, no longer that you are sentenced to a structure because you were born in it or you gave birth to it. So let's say you meet the act itself, not so much as what it's organized structurally, but what we've normalized has always been a remarkable thing. They've never been able to figure out what the hell happens with human beings. They've tried to identify it and describe it, and this happens, and what rules, and this and that. But still, this life force is a mystery. And the smallest thing can happen that shifts it in plain sight into flux, where it's up in the air. And it's up in the air in that moment because it is up in the air, not because some fault is happening. That something happens that shifts the situation up in the air where the identity is no longer on the story. But you see, there was a common feeling that allowed something to happen. Are you okay, Urja? So let's see what comes out of that conversation that I happened to have the other day there, and if anything. But well, I don't mind it being weird, but I don't think I can enter into the story if it's lame. Is that okay? If it's cool weird, we can give it a try. But if it's kind of lame weird, and what would that be? Fox News or CNN kind of lame?
I think
Their
I
explanations of the world and of life is pretty, okay.
as she likes through the crack.
Just to sell you something, okay. They're still trying to figure out what the hell's going on. I know this guy named Will Wright somewhere. He knows what the hell is happening with the human race. And I'd like to, oh, there he is. Hey, Will. What the, who the, when the, why the, what's happening? What's happening from your perspective up there in the mountains? How does it look?
They're starting to ease up a little bit here. We're in a part of the country we're sort of secluded, but people are taking some of the precautions and stuff a little more seriously over here than a lot of places. And but we're starting to ease up a little bit in ways that I feel are good. There's a lot of division here, as there is a lot of places right now. A whole lot of division that's very fierce. I find that sort of thing the most troubling often.
But what if you see that you're doing caretaking.
Yeah.
Expression. Mm-hmm. And then you also see that I've been talking to some degree about caretaking yourself. So you see what you're providing, you also think you may need. So I'm saying then, okay, A Urja that may be giving counseling and readings to others and caretaking and providing that space where others can reflect, then may have a pain in the neck in the night that is so wrenching that she's alone with it. And there's no Urja to say, hey, baby, this is what's happening. But there is an Urja that's telling her friends, this is what's happening and helping them out.
Uh-huh.
And I introduce you to the very character that has been looked as the caretaker. Meet the caretaker. Let Will get aside now. How does Will all of a sudden caretaking when people I may be dying in a minute, this may be happening. So somehow caretaking is not only literally caretaking, but looking out for someone.
Hmm.
And it's not so always specified what the looking out is until an incident happens. But you understand that the job is looking out for someone, or being there for them. And it's normalized.
Mhm.
Now you kind of understand that the very thing that Will is providing, he also can use himself,
Yeah.
but not so much a literalized. And I said, well, what is literalized? And I said, I was exercising the other morning where it looked like I was passing away with some kind of attack. But my biggest worry was someone coming in and saving me. Not so much going through the process. I felt like my body was processing it and seeing where it's at, and a kind of almost weird willingness to go if that's what the counseling was going. So it was like my body was a jury.
Mm.
And it was kind of deciding in a fair place whether to hang around or not or be with this. But it didn't mean death or life. It just meant what was happening. And it looked like parts of the body were surrendering. Even though they were active, they looked like a part of some of them were. And so a conversation was there. How are you surrendering? Where are we? I sat down on the bed with it and, just not to try to make it live longer or shorter, but I have been kind of being very much with what is now. And even if I wake up in the middle of the night, I'll be with the isness of waking up, not trying to get back to sleep or this or that. And so there's something different. I told you about that article in the Times that then said,
Yeah.
released from the patterns of behavior socially, the body has its own natural process for sleeping that you can adjust and work with or intuit once you're in that neighborhood. So they say, well, people who are craftspeople who have a relationship to sleep that way know when their body feels like to go. They may take a nap or they may do this. So they don't, the long interval sleep or the interval sleep is more their reality because their life is that way. And in certain jobs and situations, if you're working nights or whatever, but usually then people suffer, they say. And they say they're suffering because the premise is the 8 hours sleep. And so if they don't get that, then they're suffering. But then there are other ways creatively where one can have their own conversations with their being and their body about it, where it's not always, and they say, because why? Because that sleep came from you didn't have a job and you didn't have to take a car into work and you didn't have a time to punch, but your job was in the house or down the block or something like that. So it was integrated. So then sleep could have been agreements. If you were doing projects or whatever, where you may get up, you may write something, you may be making something. Especially if you're involved in something creative, then the dream state is an important part of the creative state. So it's not exactly controlled dreams, but once you are aware of the dreams as being part of a creative tool, they then become useful. Once you become aware of a sense beyond its ordinary survival sense, but you start to explore it, you explore smell, you explore taste, you start to discover food from a different place. And once you awaken it, it's not just another aspect of the thing. You see a whole other dimension was lying dormant. And that once it's awakened, it enters, it becomes second nature to your expression. So in that, one is no longer a prisoner of their own limits. You see that discovery awakens possibilities. It changes your past history into a mystery. because it releases the story from the literalness of the possessive of survival, and you see the parallel lives that were being lived with you. There's an aha moment when you see the history that you've lived. All of them were people who were keeping secretly their own existence in life or whatever. And that was part of their major existence, was to hide themselves from each other while they were living with each other, but to keep a certain secret. And so they would be secret about it. And yet if you saw it, it would be hidden in plain sight, the mumbo jumbo of existence. And you see that that very space that's hidden from the collective becomes shared in intimacy, or desired to be shared in intimacy. And intimacy means intimacy. But as a matter of fact, when we are meeting here, we're no longer talking about intimacy being a psychological affair. Although we intuit that somehow the devices that we've had of survival may surrender in a love affair because they're no longer needed. And yet they seem so much a part of the life while one had them. But you also see they were towards a genuine experience. They were kind of protectives against the most of the reasons for expressions in the world are usually captured psychologically. So something you saw was preserving, not in the literal preserving, but somehow it created the screw ups in situations because somehow it had to be genuinely so. You were not only satisfying a psychological aspect of your life, but that somehow there needed to be a genuineness in the situation that didn't need to be persuaded. It kind of more had to be discovered. So as one looks through the journey of their life, it is not the normalcy that they're contending with. They're literally on a journey. And once they perceive it, there is something genuine that's necessary to it because one can't perform unless it's genuine. You can mechanically perform, but then one can't be satisfied by the mechanics of something as if it's treatment. So now you come to a circumstance where this expression has no trip to it. It's no longer part of the continuity of poor me, but it is in fact the creative expression. And the creative expression kind of requires those on board with one to also come from a similar feeling creatively. That the psyche doesn't own this phase of the world. And that the history is no longer driving the experience in the same way. That there is a quest for genuineness that is kind of ahistorical. And it can be as dumb as a face in the crowd or an accidental happening. It's not so accidental happening. It's coming to the life without a history. It looks accidental because things without a history in our life think we shelve it into accident or this or that, but then you start to see that it's not without a history, it's without a motive. That somehow the next phase has to be true in some way. It's not spelled out. It's not the truth of a lie detector test kind of truth. But it is around no bullshit this time. And I say, why? Not because because one themselves is asking for no bullshit this time. And so I've been saying also the phase of our meeting is around no trip. It is around, is it possible for a person to find a dimension of intelligent or creative love in this place while it's all topsy-turvy in the literal world and it's all kinds of trips? And I say, if you discover it, if you discover the relationship to the family from the perspective of, you see the creative process that you're in, your discovery releases the literalness of the story. And then you meet the people that were in the story as people, where the story isn't the dominant factor, the feeling is. One then returns to the story with the feeling. The feeling gives the story life. Without the feeling, you have a karmic experience that you have to do it. With the feeling, you have more a shared experience by your presence. So one is having a dialogue between mystery and history in their own life automatically anyway. And most of the issues that they may be experiences will be around this dialogue between the creative and the literal. And that is the conversation that is happening with most of us, where there's me and me. There's me, the energy, me, the expression. There's me, the literal story. And survival becomes its main medium. So when it makes decisions or has thoughts around survival being the main medium, much of what is happening is hidden from the survivalist. So the survivalist, since it can't see the depth of it, has to internalize a plot around it. The only thing is you examine the characters in the plot and you see these characters are too lame to have made that plot. Once you visit history, you then meet mystery. And even when we're talking about meeting of the big philosophers and this and that, you may still meet them crying over a girlfriend or boyfriend. And it's not exactly a fault to cry over the girlfriend or boyfriend. It's a sign of you're human in some way, that there is a poetry that runs through the story. And it's not exactly dominated by the literalness of practicality or logic, but that one is set out towards a certain experience, and that one is determined. In some sense, you'll see that some people, even though you think it's a flaw, they shouldn't do this, they shouldn't do that, you see how determination to have the experiences. And in some cases, in my experience through life and where you saw death and living, and you saw even the expression to dying very strongly, and a kind of suicidal existence as existence, where the logic that you would eat so it would be healthy, no, they would eat so they would be unhealthy. You know, they would pick the wrong character for a relationship, the one to have the most fights with, or okay. It would seem that way, they were picking wrong, but then you see almost how precise the choices weren't allowed to simply be mellow, or that the person they had the idea tries to be happy and lay a happy idea. It seems that the life is desiring a full experience. And that when one creatively enters into the story and relationship, it is to have the experience, not to lay on it so much. So the story I read about the sleeping, if you can read that, Will, it was in its Tales of a Good Night's Rest. One of his books is Wild Night, How Taming Sleep Created Our Restless World. In organizing people into an 8-hour sleep, which was only based on an 8-hour day, when most people had more creative way of sleeping and integrated into their life. So the article is pretty good, but once reading it, you could then wake up in the middle of the night and not try to get back to sleep, or not get, there's no trying. If you feel like getting up and reading a little bit, you can do that. If you want to lie there, you can just hang. But it freed the story from having to get more sleep or not having to get more sleep. But then you kind of did fall into a semi-sleep for it. So now some of their patterns of sleep that they lay out here, where you go, where you wake up at 2 a.m, at 10 to 2, and then maybe are up for 2 hours or so, and then maybe go to sleep for another 2 hours afterwards. He said he found his own personal sleep pattern that way. And so a lot of people then are going into then creating, especially since the virus out there has freed people from the workaday world, that they are creating their day anyway. And in creating their day, they may not find an exact natural day, but that the day, the creation fits the circumstance that you're in. And that it's fluid. And we are in a kind of fluidity where it's not literally listed down. Are you okay, Will?
Yep.
So I can say goodbye? You're okay, Jai? Or no, Jai? I hope she's hearing, but she doesn't come on. You think she's listening?
I don't know. Does she listen on Wednesdays?
Look,
YouTube.
if I imagine myself being almost any one of you all, it would be an Academy Award performance if I had to do Will. So who's on YouTube?
I do.
You're on YouTube?
Not this moment, but I usually listen on YouTube.
He says he wants credit for that.
He wants credit for, well, then he has to say hi in the
But
chat.
sometimes listening on YouTube.
You have to say hi in the chat, and I know you're there.
You have to say hi in the chat.
Okay.
Can you?
I can't, not this moment.
Not this moment. Well, you know, if I have a sense of something that we're sharing, because some of the, I'll let you, somehow it has to come from an authentic place where it can touch an authentic place where I can reach it. And it would be then a question I would have myself in my own journey. So the question that was just being asked about authenticity is a question that you'll have when you're living the life. So then I say, to what extent do you assume the dynamic of the identity life that's being lived out there? And I say, that's one of your tools, but it's not you. If the cops knock on the door, you can whip out your identity and this, you own the house. Yes, what do you want? And you're speaking from that space. But then if they wear you out and beat you up and do it, you're no longer so speaking from that identity. So the identity is an agreement that one assumes creatively. That's an aspect of self, but in the world, that is you, but that is not you. So the you that you have, other dimensions of you, is shared in different ways. Friends may know a you, the neighbors may know a you, but in intimacy, the you is shared in a way that is usually hidden in plain sight in the literal world. So in that world that is shared around a feeling, they don't need your social security number for every transaction. They don't need this because there's a feeling with you. When that feeling with you is not shared, then the numbers of you are you. The literal you is you, but the literal you is not you in terms of the depth of feeling and share. And even in absence, those feelings are shared. So you see the absence and presence are relative to the deeper the feelings, the deeper the experience is happening, and where even an absence is more profound part of the relationship. Because then it's allowing you to fill in dimensions that are shared. Generally, you see that somehow something is being shared beyond the body. And that there's some elements inside one's own body that is related to another 1,000 miles away or 10,000 miles away. And you experience the discovery then of some philosophers of the I and thou phenomena, where one has a love, one has a thou. And then one also sees the life from the thou to some degree. So even if you look in the mirror, you may go out into the room seeing how it would look from the thou, from a lover seeing you. So then you see the play that folks were going, it's not exactly alone psychological or imaginative. It is in fact a creation of people once they have a feeling that they start to share something that may be very funny or dopey in another setting, but you see is brilliant creatively in a thou setting. When one shares a feeling, one sees oneself from the eyes of the other to some degree, because they're not the other. And so when you have that experience, you awaken something in yourself, and that's what I was just speaking about to Ursha. That lover you can awaken in yourself without a trick. You're already doing it by being there for people already, as a counselor, as a helper. You also see that you can utilize that guy also creatively. Because when it happens to you, pushes you into the circumstance. When it happens to you personally, that's why a counselor allows you some aspect of the story, because it captures you. But you also see that in caring or counseling for others, you may probably run into a similar circumstance yourself as that you're counseling about. And that there's a private pain of aloneness. That no matter what story, there's a Jesus alone saying, Father, why hast thou forsaken me? That there's aloneness in this circumstance, no matter what the larger story is for you. To have that experience somehow was important to the human experience, where you were completely turned into a piece of crap, where you were thought of as a piece of shit, and they could laugh at you and kick you and do anything to you because there was nothing that. So then to be a piece of shit in the moment, to experience the rage around you, the laughter around you, and to experience that is to have a direct conversation with the God energy. And it doesn't have to be a trip energy or a picture of anything, but a conversation with thyself. And you meet something else in the self. And you ask it, why are you forsaken? Why are you allowing me to be ridiculed and punished and around something that you asked me to do to free it? And the very people that you asked me to free are now killing me and kicking the shit out of me. Why art thou forsaken? And I say, well, forsaken is part of the journey, geez. And I say, why? I say, because despair. Remember despair, Danny, when you were then in India and you were doing mantras and you lost 40 pounds and you were nuts and you thought it was normal and everybody was up there doing mantras to the Himalayas, whatever. And then one day you woke up in despair. Despair was recognition of the situation you were in. That something allowed you to be there and do that. But it was the failure of that was important. It had to truly be failure. Not literally failure. But you see that your yearning required a true experience, not the psychologically gratifying one. So you understood that your body would not be satisfied with a psychologically gratifying experience if you knew intuitively it wasn't true. So you discovered that you had a relationship with some truth that runs through the story in your life. And despair was a naturalness when you try to artificially satisfy that longing. So the failure was a brilliant experience to set in motion something that can only come out of failure. Because failure had the temperament in it of yearning and seeking a genuineness that couldn't be satisfied by just something mellow or trippy. So then you found a relationship, a dialogue to a genuineness in your life that brought you into situations where the genuineness was part of the experience that was being shared. And you saw that the genuineness of life was not a possessive, but that it was aware of the flux, it was aware of the flow that ran through the life. And in the awareness of the flux, it was no longer dominated by the history being the sole element, but you saw that history contained the mystery, and that there were moments where you would have access. But in order to have access to the mystery of one's life, one entered into a non-violence, meaning non-attachment to the literal. So let's say Kai and others, if we're going into crypto, it's not to do this or not to do that, but somehow weirdly creatively, because I feel that anything that we do, even if I type something online and I find 10,000 other people that were hidden to me. I thought it was my discovery, but then you find out that there's 100 other people doing something similar. So I asked a question once about Bitcoin. Do you translate a real object into Bitcoin? And then you found 10,000 people who were hip. They were doing it anyway. They're doing that. So you find hustlers, jivers, bullshit, the same in the whole thing. But then every now and then you find friends. And they introduce you to an aspect of the world that's not so much a killer instinct of survival or making this and that, but isn't that you've met people in a creative space. And so we're kind of meeting some people creatively who are dealing in that world. But it's a creative act. So we'll see, in fact, where it takes you. But I do feel that anytime there's an interest that awakens in you, you will also discover other people who've also been doing something very similar. But it had to come to you. And so when I'm doing that sleep on my own or whatever, but then I discover also that there are other people who are saying, hold it, they're not forcing themselves into sleep patterns. But that they're finding out that somehow the body is released and it's kind of free to find a creative expression for itself, or it's healthy for itself. And so then you see that you're caring for something. It is not knowing and owning and this and that. It is that it comes with a deeper sense of almost having a spirituality running through it. The caring for something means that you assume identities when necessary, but that your relationship to something is a thread that runs through it. We had to trap you into being sane, Will, because you were trying to pull off being a crazy, nutty character. And it was too, come on, Will, you don't want to do crazy, nutty character now. You can do better than that. Unless you want to dress up as a wolf man. So if you're going to do crazy, nutty character with us, you're going to have to wear ludicrous outfits. Maybe carry a whip. So is that okay? Or you're no longer dominated by crazy, okay, you can whip it out when needed, but no longer that's you. Is that okay? That is one you that when you need it, you can get it, but you can't define you. You can't be sentenced to you.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're going to expect someone lovely to hook up with. I don't know, maybe, come on, I don't know. And I say, you wouldn't do it. So the will you would want is the will you're going to kind of have to do, okay? Say you were a deeply gay Will, and you were looking for someone named Will. So let's say I think we can manage these persona challenges, not so much psychologically, but creatively. You understand that there's a competition with something or energy out there that doesn't buy the bullshit sense of self that is related to something really happening where it's a shared experience. And
Danny, I need to go make dinner and get Tika to rehearsal, but you guys can stay on.
is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Really nice seeing you
Thank
again.
you.
Maybe I'll see you during the week again. Take
Thank
care.
you. Bye. Bye. Bye-bye.
Does that make sense, Will, that one can see it? Because you've just been through it. So now in being through it, you see it from the perspective of the director or the screenwriter or whatever. You see that there was a bunch of experiences you had to go through. But you also see that the scene won't budge if it's full of shit. And it doesn't spell out what non-full of shit is, but it does spell out what full of shit is. You understand? But it doesn't give you an identity of non-full of shit. That's still to be discovered. But you understand that somehow it's saving your life from repeating a circumstance that you've come from. Let's say there's some itch in you that karmically wants to repeat the life that it came from. So then, but then it won't let you. It's forcing a genuineness in the story, not so much based on the manipulations of the people. You want to give it a try.
Yeah. Yes.
Or do you want to psychologically create something, go out, do a couple of hey babies? Haven't I met you someplace before? You want to use that line? Yeah.
Occasionally, as they look.
Try it on Urja. Try it on Urja here now. Let's see how it flies.
I do think I've seen you somewhere before. Pretty certain.
That's too much of a question, isn't it? It has to have more of a
Oh, yeah.
mellifluous.
It's hard when you talk to an old lady when you're a young man.
Let me see. Who wrote the book of love? I wonder. Who? Do you ever hear that song before, Urja? Who wrote the book of love?
No.
No, you can look it up.
So,
Yeah. Who wrote that, Spiro? Do you know? The Book of Love, some country singer or something, wasn't it? Or some country group or something. Okay, we've shared a day.
Yes.
Nice seeing everyone. Or everyone, is anyone still there? Can you see anyone out there?
the
No.
monotones. Who wrote the Book of Love is the monotones.
Right, the monotone.
Valentine?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I remember that.
You mean it's a song?
Yeah, it's a song.
Okay.
The Book of Love. Okay, we'll see you.
Thank
Maybe
you.
tomorrow night, I'll come on with Derek. Tomorrow.
Yes.
Take care.
You
Take
You're
care.
okay?
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.